Hey guys, and thanks for joining this small little portion of talks. And today we're gonna talk about the main differences between the 2014 and 2022, and what are the biggest differences in those ones, which is basically one is just a starting point of a conflict, and of course it's started even earlier with the annexation of Crimea, and the tactics and the methods that were used and how everything changed in 2022 when everything was done more openly. So let's start with like 2014 and like the 13, 14, that period. Everything Russia did was done like really, sneaky. It was called like a hybrid, and it's actually a hybrid. They didn't openly tell that they're soldiers. They didn't have like any insignias and stuff like that to show off, but everyone actually understood who they were. It's also a really weird thing where everyone understands who they are, where they coming from, and everything, and all this kind of crap about like, hey, they're just like local militia, and they got the tanks from the shafts and everything like that. Yeah, you can just go to any shop and buy a full functioning Soviet tank. And it was really hard, and it was really weird in terms of like how you can balance it and how you can understand who's who, like who's right, who's wrong, all this kind of stuff. And that's where Russia is strongest in like playing this game of like hide and seek, of disguise, and saying, no, that's not us, we didn't do it. While you can just like dig a little bit deeper and understand that it's not true at all. And the operation itself, it was more of a like from a military standpoint, until they of course used their military forces, which is also, I'll touch on that, just don't want to forget about it. So if we talk about the military standpoint, it started as a anti-terrorist operation, and then it became a joint forces operation. So basically in this case they didn't tell them that, hey, we're Russian military and everything like that. So basically from a Ukrainian standpoint, what happened there was like a terrorist attack, just terrorists trying to take over the land, doing some crazy stuff. So it's comes down to internal affairs ministry of internal defense, and so basically police forces. So it was called a anti-terrorist operation, and this was the police forces like moving there. And but it was clear that they have their Russian military support, and all the tanks, artillery system, and everything, that terrorists are not really easy to get hold on. And we needed to use the military forces too. So it was changed to a joint forces operation. But from the scale of it, it felt more or less like an anti-terrorist operation at the start. Then the fighting got heavier with the tanks, with reactive artillery system, which this problem allowed Russia just to shoot artillery system from behind the border. So they were just like on their territory shooting reactive artillery over to our border, and we couldn't like answer because they didn't openly do it. And if we did, it would be like that we started the war. So it was a really, really hard situation to go through. Everything hang on a really thin balance of like balancing this problematic messages and understanding how we can get from this situation in the best possible way, return our territories. So it kind of pushed to more of a slowly burning conflict, and we were just like preparing our military forces and working to have more stable possibility, more become stronger And this is also what pushed us towards thinking about joining NATO and finally changing our military to NATO standards and things like that. And in general, of course, it was not such a fierce big conflict because there were only two regions involved. It was not as big, it was not as insane. And if you think about it, the main difference, of course, would be the artillery and the aviation. So back in 2014, there were barely any aviation, and artillery was there, and of course, armored vehicles and tanks, but the sheer numbers were a lot and a lot different. So that was the conflict that they started, is basically that led to this one. And if you think about it, what they ideally would want is take over those two regions and Crimea, and basically try to push the mainland corridor to Crimea, and of course ideally have the south of Ukraine. But it was planned on the stages. From my understanding and point of view, it looks really like that they wanted to put those two regions, make them part of the Russia or whatever, and then on the next um, stage of this operation through the years, just go and move forward on other regions of Ukraine, mainly south and closer to the bank of the Dnipro River. So, but it didn't go as well as planned, of course, because of our volunteer fighters, of the fierce resistance of Ukrainians. But still, it was not as of a thing in Ukraine in terms of you have only those two regions, and a lot of people don't feel that problem and how it's hurting us and how it's really hard thing to go through. Of course, we had some refugees, we had people affected, but it was just not too many people understood the danger that it actually led to, and it was just a leading point for 2022 when they finally opened their cards and said and openly attacked Ukraine without any reasons whatsoever. In terms of course, I'm talking about sanity, so it's just pure insanity. And here in 2022, it's different. It's open. Our society really understands the threat because they come from everywhere. There are much more front lines, much more people affected and will be affected by this tragedy, this nonsense and useless bloodshed. But all we have to do is just to stay firm and hold on. In terms of military, the 2022 is of course much harder because of the technical part of the war, in terms of how many weaponry you have, how much human resources you have, artillery shells, aviation, everything. So here we have all of this stuff, and of course the rockets that they just can throw on any city in Ukraine, atop of civilians' heads, and it's really insane in that regard. And of course, it's just a part of the plan of the conflict that was planned long ago. And 2013, 14 was just a starting point where they were trying some ways. Of course, they tried to poison our society from inside, but they didn't get as much evidence from it, or as much as they wanted. So they decided to move to the next stage, which was just take over Ukraine entirely, and behead in the Kiev region, and taking over south, taking over east. but at the end of the day, we're still here. We're still holding on. From a military standpoint, of course, it's much harder right now, but in another way, it's also easier in terms that you clearly and everyone knows who's your enemy, and the society is much more in tune with everything that happens. Everyone is living through this tragedy and understands the dangers that it brings. While this hybrid thing with, like, poison in minds, we're not there, that's not us, we're not here, this is some kind of, like, there are other internal problems and all of that. It was really hard back then to, like, go through, digest, and really understand uh, what's happening. Of course, for the majority of Ukrainian society, it was like point blank and easy. But if you're trying to understand someone from abroad, it was insanely difficult to explain what actually happening and how it's happening, the processes, the amount of resources they used to poison not only Ukrainians' minds with all this kind of mind games and playing that's no, that's not us. And also in Europe and United States, I know that Russia really working well in that, like, propaganda department of, and they have a really big dividends from that, an impact. It has its uses. So in 2022, it's much easier because they openly just, like, showed all their cards and put them on a table. And in that regard, it's really easier, and Ukrainian society is has never been so united than it is right now. And of course, it's a natural thing when you get attacked, when you have freedom and your right to identify yourself, choose your own path is threatened. And not only yours, but, like, your friends and family, your future generations. It's something you can't just, sit it out and say, hey, whatever. It's a really threatening situation. So in that regard, it's much easier. But from a military standpoint, of course, the amount of artillery, of tanks and BMPs, and all the UAVs and vehicles they have uh, is insane. The aviation, so we're fighting in the sky, we're fighting on the ground, we're fighting with artillery, we're fighting with reactive system, and also there is this rockets. And everyone is Ukraine just get used to all this constant sirens that there may be a big rocket attack on a civilian town. And doesn't sound like a terrorist, something a terrorist would do. Yeah, it is, and that's one of the reasons I don't write Russia in capital letters, is because they're just a bunch of terrorists. It's just a terrorist state, and until this changed, their country doesn't deserve a capital letter. And in general, that's probably the main differences that I would point out, where 2013-14 was a really, like, hybrid combination of constant lies, disguise, and trying to change the facts, make, like, fake things really stand out, and trying to convince everyone that this is it, that they're, like, liberators, they're, like, helping. And it was, like, really crazy. From a military standpoint, at the start, it was, like, really hard, but then we figured it out how to fight against that hybrid aggression. We managed to save the integrity of the society and understanding what's happening out there. And then in 2022, we had the ability to defend ourselves, of course, mainly because we recognized the threats. Of course, ideally, I would love us and our society, and of course, people in charge, to recognize it faster and better. But that's what we have right now, and you can't change the past. But still, we hold on, which means we did enough back then to understand and prepare us for the future threat. that actually fell upon us right now. And I wouldn't say there is much more difference, just like the scale is bigger and it's an openness about what they do. And of course, you still can hear that's not us, we're not doing it, like they shooting themselves and all this kind of bullcrap. But right now, of course, it looks much more insane and really hard to believe, even for people like living abroad and understanding that it doesn't make any sense and it's just straight out stupid. But of course, they still working in that department. But at least we can see the enemy through, and we can see it clearly without like any other options that you would have here. That would be the main difference. Of course, I took the part in 2014 as a volunteer fighter for Ukraine. I was in a volunteer battalion back then, and right now, of course, I rejoined the military to oppose and defend my country. I mean, oppose, of course, the invasion and Russian aggression and the war. So I'm now again in the military. There's probably I could tell something else about those two dates, but in general, if you look at it on the long term and the long scale, you can see that this is like a planned parts or stages of a big plan of how it evolved and how it unfolded. And I think we managed pretty well or decent. Of course, as I said, I would love us to do much better than we did, but we're still here, we're still holding on, and we're gonna win this war. So thanks everyone. Cheers.